Anyway, how's it going?
How's it going? Well,
you were just telling us how you're gonna send your kids to school for libtards.
Yes.
I've finishing school.
I've moved permanently or temporarily or partially to a liberal West Coast city, and partly by my children's demand, and also because of my fiance. And I'm like, my kids need to be Americanized. They need to fully dipped in the river Styx in the same way that I was dipped in the river Styx. They need to be sent to a public school, and especially like
to build character,
and one that is really in the heart of power in a way. I mean, not the way New York is, but in its own way, and like to feel, and also.
And you think it's here to stay?
Yeah, I don't think that there's nothing changes really.
So you're rearing your children as Machiavellians.
Well, of course,
I think actually that sort of level of kind of there's this great Persian word ketman that Chisla Malosh wrote about. Do you know the story of ketman? Ketman, in Malosh, and this is from Malosh's book, The Captive Mind, which is came out in like 61, 62 or something like that, and is really, this sort of marvelous meditation on just Orwellianism and
communist Poland.
In communist Poland. And the backbone of the book, which is absolutely worth reading, are the sort of biographical sketches of four people he knew who he just codenames Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, but you can look up their names. And these are sort of studies of how people compromised with power or became servants of it, or worked with it in general, as Militia did, because he was in the resistance during the war, and then he was kind of sort of started to be like a diplomat. For the new Polish regime. And so like it wasn't like the people that were running this thing were all from his generation. And those are great chapters, but in a way, sort of, he has this chapter on ketman, which is again a Persian word meaning it's like takia.
Ketamine.
Not ketamine. Ketamine is funny you should say that, but
why are you on? Are you? In
I am not on ketamine.
Are you
I'm
in
not
the
on ketamine. I will disclose that. Someone gave me a ketamine for the first time ever at a party, like 2 nights ago.
You mean like a bump of like
ketamine? I don't know.
How did you enjoy?
Did you go?
You snorted it.
I did not go into the hole. It was not. I just it takes a lot of drugs to move me at my age. I'm like.
I don't know. Ketamine is pretty cool.
Yeah. Maybe it was.
I don't do it anymore.
Maybe I just didn't take enough, but I was not.
It's
anyway.
Weird. Anyway,
let's get back. Let's get back to the important political concept of. Actually, what's funny is that another of the chapters in The Captive Mind is called "The Pill of Murdy Bing," which is like a political pill that seems to be the blue pill, but also seems a lot like ketamine. So right. Yeah. So
True.
the it just they dissociate. And then anyway, ketman is basically the art of political dissimulation. So you're like going through life pretending you're like in the closet. You're pretending to be a completely orthodox person, maybe even a slightly fanatical person. You shouldn't pretend to be too fanatical. But there are also ways of like dissimulating in ways that sort of will reveal yourself to your friends, but not your enemies.
Right, like
that
kind
will,
of a Straussian.
Yeah, right. But sort of, with this sort of element of like fun and playfulness behind it.
It's funny that you
don't really find
that.
in Strauss.
Well, we have in America. There's a Russian term called styob that we've covered extensively on this podcast, which basically means it's a form of late Soviet parody that involves an extremely high level of over-identification so that people don't really know where you stand.
Right.
Yeah.
And you kind of see that phenomenon rearing its head in the United States, especially with Trump.
Say a little more about over-identification, like over...
Well, it sort of collapses the categories of irony and sincerity and sort of makes everything into... Well, yeah, because in the late Soviet, in a falling empire, there
so
was...
you might like overstate regime propaganda in a way.
Yes, and being overzealous or overly fanatical, you are actually signaling to the in-crowd, the cognoscenti, that you are actually doing resistance.
Right.
AOC,
Right.
Yeah. Actually, I think that clip that's been circulating of AOC where she's like, "I'm doing my nails as an act of reclamation," could almost be seen as
it could almost be seen as
actually,
because it's actually she like has the sense of humor to know that in a way she's parodying herself.
I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like we can't get.
But who would actually say that? Like no one would actually be that like ditzy. Like
that's the Job thing too. Is it doesn't even really matter.
Well, it's. I mean, the change that is so amazing, and I was just like, this is at the time. Even in 2020, when all this stuff was happening, I was like, this is going to backfire because you basically took the ideology or the sort of way of thinking that was the property, what I would say at Brown 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. This way of thinking was the exclusive property of the cool kids at Brown. Right. And it was the same way of thinking.
Which way of thinking?
Wokeness in general.
Yeah, okay.
Right. And so even in 2020, it's almost hard to remember now, say even like before 2015, it's like before woke crossed over, right? Because it crossed over like punk. It was like basically
into the mainstream.
What year would you say being woke crossed over?
It was between 2015 and 2020, I would say. Maybe between 2010 and 2020. But it crossed over. And like basically now it's like you can go and see a movie like this Martin Scorsese directed this movie After Hours.
Yeah.
After Hours.
Of course.
Right. After Hours, right? And basically like the sort of like the residual like punkophobia that is present in After Hours. There's no other way to describe that but as like punkophobia, right? And it was like punk or alt was like, this scary, scary thing.
Well, yeah,
right?
that there still was.
The Mohawk. Right? Mm-hmm. Right? These were bad people,
Well, you could have a protagonist, right, that was like a normie, like a citizen who was confronting these other forces.
Confronting this horrible, Mohawked, forces of like degeneration and then punk like crosses over and like, suddenly it's sort of once punk crosses over, it's like impossible to be like punk again in the same way. Like there's still a punk scene, but it's like almost like, what's the point? Who are you trying to like scare, right? You know? And so with wokeness, basically, it was just like, wait, all of the energy in this thing that makes it so compelling is basically, it's like war against the mainstream. It's a pâté la bourgeoisie. I'm ruining the French, right? And so, I was reading like The Atlantic recently. I don't know why I was doing this, but I was reading The Atlantic. I opened. It was probably a link. It was probably a link. I followed a link, and I'm scrolling down this thing, and there's this interstitial ad, like between the blocks of text, and it's an ad from MasterCard, and it says something like, "Learn how to make payments safe for transgender and non-binary people."
Yeah.
And basically, like once MasterCard has like appropriated like this, like, let's make payments safe for non-binary people, right? I mean, where else do you go with that, right? It's this sort of dynamic front that basically has to move, and once it becomes sort of the universal ideology of everything, and just this like syrup that everyone gets in their like food since like kindergarten.
It's like the lingua franca now.
It's like the lingua franca, and so there's no tension, there's no energy in it, there's no like voltage differential. It's just basically, and to like younger Zoomers, it's basically just the stuff that you're supposed to believe. Yeah. And it's so much like the energy of being for it, sort of, you can get some of that energy off of like rebelling against your parents, or like it's just harder to like, once you're at the point of like, makes payments safe for transgender and non-binary people.
Right.
Right. The energy they created is gone.
Yeah.
Is that true? Is that like...
Well, I mean, that's
where
I'm
Catmon or Stub comes in.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Why are you so sure that it's sort of here to stay, that it's kind of embedded in
Because
power?
It's embedded in bureaucratic rules. It's embedded in when you have... Like I think that it was either passed or about to be passed, some kind of, civil rights bill making dead naming basically considering it formally equivalent to racism, essentially. So you're basically at the point where 10 years ago in Canada or whatever, Jordan Peterson is like, but I shouldn't have to use these pronouns, right?
Yeah.
which is what
Good
made
job,
him famous. Yeah. And now, it's basically you have a social change and a change in power that goes along with that. Which of these sort of precedes or causes the other is sort of really hard to follow, but they work in tandem.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like COVID regulation in a way, where everyone now is at screw all this stuff.
We don't say the C word on this podcast. Just kidding. Go on.
Yes. It's
coronavirus?
It's like this new virus that's been going. Where basically, people have I'm a moderate on the virology. Viruses are real. Like, I hate them. I don't like getting them. But basically, the general cultural trend is that sort of everyone has acknowledged that, like, you just have to take your chances with the virus. But yet you still have all of these like bureaucratic structures that were set up to take this, and in some cases those don't really have any purchase and they just get ignored. People just see establishments don't even notice that they have signs in their windows requiring masks.
but this reminds me of what my parents told me about life in the Soviet Union, where there was all this signage and messaging that people simply ignored.
Right. Right. And it's just like, how did you think those Black Lives Matter signs were going to age?
Well, here's my question.
Yeah,
what happens if a black person dead names?
Ooh,
Who's more oppressed in the stack?
I think actually, the answer to the question is very easy, which is that basically all of the status that you get from being in a protected class accrues from the allegiance of that protected class to the party. Mm-hmm. So when you basically are like Clarence Thomas and you break with the party, suddenly actually your race card is not only not an asset, it may even be a liability.
Mm-hmm. You get called the N-word on Twitter.
You get called the N-word on Twitter, like by people, someone made up someone made up one of those fake Black Lives Matter signs with all the normal Black Lives Matter propaganda, but it sneaks in the middle one, we believe in signs. Mm-hmm. Clarence Thomas is an N-word.
Yeah.
But in this house, we believe.
Right, exactly.
Clarence Thomas is
So you basically, like, as soon as you break with the party, like, you realize that it's not actually about having that piece of status. It's about being with the party.
Right. Yeah. Nick Mullen had the best tweet about this, which was, your racism is calling Clarence Thomas the N-word when he makes a ruling you don't agree with. My racism is not knowing the difference between Clarence Thomas and James Earl Jones.
I'm trying to imagine Clarence Thomas playing Darth Vader. Imagine, what if, is there any law saying that Clarence Thomas, we're all looking for presidential candidates in 2024. Imagine if Clarence Thomas ran.
I want Hell Dog v. Trump again.
I
want to do it all over again, baby.
Really? Do you think she will?
We miss Hillary.
Do you think she'll push Biden aside, like the decrepit, shambling wreck he is?
I would love it.
Who's the decrepit, shambling wreck?
Well, there's all. It's like this nation of. Trump is a.
I want Clarence Thomas to run and to make "I Believe I Can Fly" his campaign. That would be baller.
There's noise has been made of a potential Kanye West campaign.
Well, he tried to run before. And yeah.
He doesn't have the wherewithal as a bipolar man to.
As a bipolar man. That's good.
Anyway. But okay, on that note, I have a question about your famous concept of the cathedral, which
Please.
maybe you can define for those of our listeners who haven't heard it or haven't heard it explained that way. So like one of the key features of the cathedral, right, is how all of these prestigious institutions across media and academia seem to be totally aligned in their like core messaging and cultural values in a way that seems like coordinated or
yes, but they're not. But it's not
but
actually coordinated.
Well, you've always said, and I agree with you, that it's actually decentralized.
Right.
So then why do people feel so inclined? Why do they want to believe in conspiracy theories? Is it like a matter of finding like a Gerardian scapegoat, or just a matter of mere self-importance?
Okay. Let's go through the two those separate questions. I think you define sort of the cathedral concept very well, which is that we basically look at all of these very expensive brand names like Harvard and the New York Times, and these in general information or prestigious information organs. I like, for example, when I talk about, what some call the mainstream media, I prefer to just say the prestige media, because that's a term that's understandable by basically both sides. The question is to what extent the prestige corresponds with reality. And so when you look at these institutions, you see something very interesting, which is that you could easily mistake them for branches of a single giant, for example, the way media worked in East Germany, not in Nazi Germany, was that it was basically controlled by the propaganda ministry under Goebbels, right? And so basically Goebbels had like administrative control of the whole Nazi media, and so everything in Nazi media became Nazi flavored. One of my favorite examples is the great writer Victor Klemperer, who was he was Jewish, and he managed to survive the Third Reich by having a German wife, marrying a shiksa, always a smooth move, and gets you out of a lot of jams, and it got him basically all the way through the Second World War. And he was a philologist, he was a literary critic, and he wrote a diary which sort of came out in East Germany, so it wasn't very famous until like 20 years ago. And one of the things he recounts in this diary is that he had a cat, and he subscribed to a cat magazine. And in 1931, his cat magazine was all about cats. But by 1934, the same magazine was all about the German cat. Right, and so everything becomes flavored with this Nazi ideology, and I'm not saying it, and when you compare the world in which sort of everything, including children's books and cat magazines and everything, becomes sort of flavored with woke ideology.
The anti-racist cat.
Yeah, the non-binary cat, right? And I mean, there's a lot of rich thinking that can go into this, right? The non-binary cat, and
so fun.
I mean, you can certainly have. I don't know if you can have an anti-racist cat. You can certainly have an anti-racist dog. And
or just a racist dog.
Or
you can get a really racist.
Or exactly. So you can see how these questions can like become, relevant even in your cat magazine, right? I mean, the German cat, presumably cat genetics are important. The purest bloodlines of cat are found in Germany, right? It's like you can make anything sort of have the texture of like important and relevant reality, and then when you step outside it, you're just like the German cat, right? And so the question with sort of the cathedral is like, we know the way in Nazi Germany that the cat magazine became about the German cat. And the way that our media works isn't anything like that. It's like totally different, but it somehow produces the same kind of result. And so there's a kind of coordination going on that, and my interpretation of what that coordination is to notice that when you look at all of these sort of this decentralized media sphere is a marketplace of ideas. Mm-hmm. And we normally assume that in a marketplace of ideas with a lot of producers and a lot of consumers, the best, most inexpensive ideas will succeed, or at least the best ideas will succeed. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that...
Best meaning.
Yeah, best meaning truest. Well, right. But what does the best mean in this context? And the problem is that basically what happened structurally in the 20th century is that substantively these information markets were put in control of the state. Right. And so like the most important, if you want to matter and make an impact, do you want to be a Foreign Service officer, or do you want to be a New York Times reporter? Mm-hmm. You probably want to be a New York Times reporter. Mm-hmm. And because you have a much more discretion to change the world, and certainly when the State Department says how high, the New York Times jumps, right?
So what you're saying basically is that this supposedly free marketplace of ideas is essentially subsidized.
It's subsidized, and it's like... power flows into it. And you know how...
like ideologically subsidized.
Yeah, it's ideologically subsidized in a sense. Basically, it's like the old, question of governance where you say, who watches the watchdogs? Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, we're going to make the press the watchdog. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, who watches the press? And you're like, well, they watch themselves. Mm-hmm. They watch each other, right?
Yeah.
And what you're doing... when you let basically power flow into the media and the universities in that way, where you also are trusting the universities as like the final word of truth, you wind up trusting Peter Daszak that he should go and collect all the viruses. Right. And and like it's a really bad result in my opinion, And so what you're doing is it's sort of like if you like let nutrients flow into a lake, mm-hmm. it poisons the lake because things that eat the nutrients grow. Mm-hmm. If you give power to these media organs, ideas that feel empowering are going to grow in the same way. And sort of all of the, the woke ideas are sort of ideas that kind of produce the most leverage in a sense.
They have like exponential growth or something.
Right.
I'm mathematically retarded. Don't quote me on that. But I think what people correctly intuit is that the so-called marketplace of ideas often feels like a keynote presentation that everybody is passing around with the same talking
because
points.
It's optimized for this one thing, which is very, very powerful ideas.
Yeah.
And so, when you're basically like foreign policy is like one example of sort of ways mm-hmm. to see these powerful ideas, because when Americans, 10 years ago became intoxicated with the idea of the Arab Spring, right. They basically were like, oh, I matter, why the wine on drinking Chardonnay can help overthrow these nasty dictators mm-hmm. in a foreign land and bring down tyranny in Egypt or whatever. And like that made them feel good. Mm-hmm. And because it made them feel good, it was sort of a naturally popular idea. It was also a terrible idea. Mm-hmm. And it also had this strange symmetry where it made them feel good to have this idea of doing good. But when the whole thing turned into a shit show and went bad, they weren't like, ooh, I did a bad thing. They were like, ooh, well, let me change the channel. What was on? Something else. There's a ball game on.
Well, because it makes the whole system also is primed to make things feel outside of your control anyway.
Right.
I mean, if you get the result you wanted, then
it doesn't produce.
Good. If you don't get the result that you wanted,
it doesn't produce any responsibility anywhere in the system. Nobody got fired for losing the war in Afghanistan. Nobody at state got fired for the Arab Spring, which state basically caused.
I mean. Sorry. Yeah. No, you go ahead.
But when we're talking about coordination also, there is a way that things are coordinated, right, in a purely technical, non-ideological way now that, like, say, Goebbels didn't have access to, which is, like, through the internet and information technology.
Sure. I mean, I guess when I mean Goebbels' coordination was like a top-down command hierarchy. Goebbels would basically review the scripts of the Nazi film directors and be like, no, I need this change, I need that change. Right? There's sort of no Goebbels doing that, but there's definitely some sensitivity readers doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so
the Soviet Union had the same.
Sure.
But the Soviet the committees and stuff.
They were more administrative, though. That was more top down.
Than Nazi Germany?
No, than here. It was probably less top down than Nazi Germany, but more top down than here, definitely.
But I guess my question would be like, I think we also think of the shift from like top down to decentralized as something that was willed into being by like a cabal of shadowy elites, when it almost feels like the obsolescence of like top-down governance is also like a technical informational problem, not a political one exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, top-down governance, I mean, I will be, the first to defend top-down governance. Basically, anything that works was done by top-down governance. If you drive a car, it was built by top-down governance, right? You watch a movie, it was done by top-down governance, right? And